The Galactic Council chamber fell silent when Prime walked through the doors. He was massive, standing nearly 8 feet tall, his gray fur marked with scars from 100 battles. His golden eyes swept across the assembled representatives of 12 species, and most of them looked away. There were apex predators, and even diplomats felt the ancient fear when one entered a room. But Dawson did not look away. The human ambassador had served on the station for 15 years, and she had learned that the beings who looked most dangerous were often the ones carrying the heaviest burdens. She saw something in the Alpha's eyes that she had never seen before. She saw desperation. Prime stopped at the center of the chamber and spoke in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. He told them about the plague. It had started on there 6 months ago, spreading through the adult population like fire through dry grass. Their scientists had tried everything. Their healers had failed. Their warriors could not fight an enemy they could not see or touch. The plague killed only adults. The cubs were immune, but they would not stay cubs forever. In 3 years, they would mature, and then they would die like their parents. The faced extinction, and Prime had come to beg for help. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The counselor, and being with multifaceted eyes, spoke first. Her species had no love for the who had raided their border colonies for centuries. She asked what help the Alpha expected from those he had once called prey. Prime lowered his massive head. He said that he had not come to ask for a cure. His scientists believed one might be found eventually, but it would take years, perhaps decades. He had come to ask for something far more difficult. He had come to ask someone to raise his children. The chamber erupted in confused murmurs. They were the proudest species in known space. They trusted no one outside their own packs. For an alpha to suggest placing cubs in alien hands was unthinkable. Dawson raised her hand and waited for silence. She asked how many cubs they were discussing. She expected the alpha to say a few dozen, perhaps 100 of the most important bloodlines. Prime met her eyes and said 12,000, every cub on there, the entire next generation of his species. The silence that followed was absolute, felt her heart beating hard in her chest. She understood what this request truly meant. The Alpha was not just asking for, he was placing the future of his entire civilization in foreign hands. If humanity agreed, they would hold the power to shape what they would become. She asked for a recess and gathered her human delegation in a private chamber. Ben Harper there ran calculations on his tablet. He said that housing 12,000 cubs would require massive resources. They would need specialized facilities, trained caregivers, and years of commitment. The cubs would mature slowly, not reaching adulthood for nearly a decade. Asked if it was possible, Ben said it was possible but incredibly difficult. Cubs were not human children. They were natural predators with instincts bred for hunting. They would need space to run, meat to eat, and careful handling to prevent accidents. Another advisor warned that the political implications were enormous. If they raised the next generation they would be accused of cultural manipulation. Other species might claim humanity was building an army of loyal predators. Listened to all of them and then made her decision. She said that a species had come to them in their darkest hour and asked for help. If humanity turned away, they would prove that the galaxy was right to fear cooperation. But if they accepted, they would show that trust could exist even between predator and prey. She returned to the council chamber and told Prime that humanity would accept his cubs. She promised that they would be raised with respect for their heritage. They would learn history and customs alongside whatever else they needed to survive. When the cure was found, they would be returned to their people. The Alpha stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something that shocked every being in the chamber. He bowed his head to a human. He said that his people had once called humans weak. They were small and soft, with no claws or fangs. They ate plants as well as meat, and they formed bonds even with species that could harm them. that had dismissed them as prey animals playing at civilization. But now he understood something. True strength was not about claws or teeth. True strength was having the power to destroy another and choosing instead to protect them. He had misjudged humanity, and he would spend whatever time remained to him making sure his people remembered this lesson. The arrangements took 3 months. Transport ships were modified to carry young passengers. Human volunteers were trained in biology and behavior. Facilities were built on Earth and its colony worlds, with open spaces where cubs could run and hunt supervised prey. On the day of departure, Prime came to the human transport ship personally. He carried a small bundle in his massive arms, a silver-furred cub with eyes the color of morning sky. He told that this was his daughter, the heir to his bloodline. He placed the cub in the arms of Ben Harper, who had volunteered to lead the first foster group. The alpha leaned close and spoke words that Ben would remember for the rest of his life. "Teach her what it means to survive," the alpha said. "Not just with strength, but with wisdom. Show her that there is more than one way to be powerful." Ben looked down at the small creature in his arms. She was warm and soft, and her tiny claws gripped his sleeve as she looked up at him with complete trust. He promised the alpha that he would protect her with his life. The transport ships departed that night, carrying 12,000 cubs toward an uncertain future. Prime watched them go from the observation deck, and for the first time in his long life, the great warrior wept. He had given away everything his people had, and he could only pray that the humans would return something better. Behind him, the counselor watched with her multifaceted eyes. She told him that he had made either the decision in galactic history or the most foolish. Only time would tell which. Prime did not turn around. He said that sometimes the bravest thing a warrior could do was put down his weapons and trust another to fight in his place. His cubs were in human hands now. Whatever they became, they would carry a piece of humanity with them forever. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, and somewhere among them, 12,000 sleeping cubs dreamed of a world they would not see again for many years. The greatest experiment in galactic history had begun. The first year was chaos. Lisa Monroe had spent 20 years as a schoolteacher before taking charge of the Montana compound, but nothing had prepared her for cubs. They were fast, curious, and born with instincts that told them to chase anything that moved. 3 caregivers were injured in the first month alone, and Lisa spent her nights wondering if humanity had made a terrible mistake. The cubs did not mean to hurt anyone. They were simply doing what their bodies demanded. When a human ran, something deep in their brains said to pursue. When they caught their target, their jaws would close before their minds could stop them. It was not aggression. It was nature. Lisa refused to give up. She studied everything that could tell her about development. She learned that cubs in traditional packs were taught to control their instincts through supervised hunts and physical competition. They needed outlets for their predatory drives, or those drives would find outlets on their own. She redesigned the entire program. The compounds were expanded to include vast hunting grounds stocked with animals bred specifically for the cubs to chase. Every day began with a group hunt where the cubs could run and pounce and satisfy the ancient hunger in their blood. By the time they gathered for their other lessons, they were calm and focused. The second innovation came from an unexpected source. A 14-year-old boy named Danny Cole lived on the ranch next to the Montana compound. His parents were veterinarians who had volunteered to help with medical care, and Danny had grown up around animals of all kinds. He had no fear of the cubs and no hesitation about playing with them. Lisa watched him wrestling with a young named one afternoon. The alpha's daughter was twice Danny's weight and far stronger, but she held back her strength instinctively. When Danny tapped her nose and said he won, she made a sound that Lisa had never heard from her before. She laughed. Lisa realized something important that day. The cubs did not just need handlers. They needed friends. They needed beings their own age who would treat them as equals rather than dangerous animals to be managed. She developed what she called the pack integration method, placing small groups of cubs with human families who had children willing to grow up beside them. It changed everything. Cubs who lived with human families learned to read facial expressions and body language. They discovered that a smile meant friendship and tears meant someone needed comfort. They played human games and taught their foster siblings ones. They became something new, a generation that belonged to two worlds at once. And Danny became inseparable. They explored the forests together, swam in the cold mountain lakes, and spent long nights talking about everything and nothing. Danny taught how to play chess, and she taught him the art of tracking prey by scent. He showed her human movies about heroes who won through cleverness rather than strength, and she told him stories of the great hunts her father had led. But there were hard times too. Dr. Nora was the child psychologist assigned to the program, and she saw the struggles that many cubs faced. They were caught between two identities, by blood but raised among humans. Some rejected their heritage entirely, refusing to speak their native language or participate in traditional ceremonies. Others clung desperately to customs they barely remembered, terrified of losing themselves. Nora worked with each cub individually, helping them understand that they did not have to choose. They could be both. They could honor their ancestors while also embracing the new lessons they had learned. Identity was not a cage but a garden where many different flowers could grow together. Struggled more than most. She was the alpha's daughter, expected to carry the weight of her entire species on her shoulders. Some nights she would slip away from the compound and run alone through the darkness, howling at a moon that was not the one she had been born under. Danny always found her and sat with her until the pain passed. In the 5th year, word came from the plague had claimed Prime. The great Alpha had held on longer than anyone expected, fighting the disease with the same stubbornness he had shown in every battle of his life. But even the strongest warrior could not defeat an enemy that lived in his own blood. Lisa gathered the cubs in the main hall and told them as gently as she could. Many of them had been too young to remember their parents clearly, and the news felt distant, like a story about strangers. But others wept openly, mourning family they would never see again. Received a private message that her father had recorded before the end. She watched it alone in her room, and Danny waited outside the door for 3 hours until she finally let him in. Her eyes were dry, but he could see the grief carved into every line of her face. She told him what her father had said. He had apologized for leaving her. He had expressed pride in reports of her progress. And he had given her one final command, the last words of a dying alpha to his heir. Remember who you are, he had told her, but become who you must be. She did not fully understand what he meant. Not yet. But she carried those words with her through the remaining years of her fostering, turning them over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by water. The 8th year arrived faster than anyone expected. The cure had finally been developed, tested, and distributed across the surviving adults were recovering, and the planet was ready to welcome its children home. Lisa stood at the transport terminal and watched the cubs, now young adults, preparing to depart. 12,000 who had arrived as frightened orphans were leaving as something the galaxy had never seen before. They spoke 2 languages fluently. They understood both the hunt and the harvest. They had learned that strength could be gentle and that mercy was not weakness. Danny was going with them. He had been granted special permission to serve as a cultural liaison, the first human ever invited to live permanently on had insisted, and no one could refuse the daughter of Prime. Before they boarded the ship, turned to Lisa and embraced her. The gesture was purely human, something a traditional would never do with someone outside their pack, but was not a traditional anymore. She thanked Lisa for everything, for the patience, for the love, for treating 12,000 predators like children who deserved kindness rather than fear. She said that whatever happened next, that would never forget what humanity had done for them. Lisa wiped tears from her eyes and told to go change the world. The ships rose into the sky, carrying a transformed generation toward home. On the observation deck, Lisa watched until they disappeared among the stars. She did not know what the future would hold, but she knew that something fundamental had shifted in the galaxy, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. They looked exactly like the images had studied, but it felt like a foreign land. The sky was the wrong shade of blue, and the air carried scents she did not recognize. She had been a cub when she left, too young to form lasting memories. Now she was walking on soil her ancestors had hunted for 10,000 generations, and she felt like a stranger. The welcoming ceremony was held in the great plaza of the capital city. Elder presided over the event, a massive gray-furred who had survived the plague through sheer, stubborn refusal to die. He had led what remained of the adult population through the darkest years, and he considered himself the rightful authority until proper leadership could be restored. He watched the returning generation descend from their ships, and his golden eyes grew troubled with each passing moment. They walked wrong. Traditional moved with the fluid grace of hunters, always ready to spring into action. These young ones walked upright and relaxed, their postures open and unguarded. They looked like prey animals. Worse, they talked wrong. They greeted each other with human words mixed into their native tongue. They smiled, showing teeth in the human gesture of friendship rather than the display of aggression. Some of them even embraced their waiting relatives, wrapping arms around each other in a manner that would have been considered deeply inappropriate just a decade ago. His concern turned to alarm when he saw the human delegation that had accompanied the returning generation. 200 humans had come as cultural liaisons, led by Lisa Monroe, and a young man named Danny Cole who stood beside as if he belonged there. The elder could smell something disturbing between them, a bond that went deeper than mere friendship. The Alpha's daughter had given her loyalty to a human. The first formal council meeting was held the following day, demanded a full accounting of what the humans had done to children. He used words like corruption and contamination. He accused humanity of deliberately weakening the next generation to neutralize thee as a military power. Listened to his accusations with growing anger. She had learned patience from her human teachers, but she had also inherited her father's pride. When finally paused for breath, she rose to speak. She told the council that yes, they had been changed. They had learned things their ancestors never knew. They had discovered that you could disagree without fighting, that you could be strong without being cruel, and that the greatest victories came not from destroying your enemies but from turning them into friends. Slammed his fist on the table. He said that these were the words of prey, not predators. They had ruled this sector of space through strength and fear for centuries. Now their own children spoke of friendship and mercy as if these were virtues. Asked him a simple question. She asked how many were alive today. Hesitated. The plague had reduced their population from billions to barely 3 million survivors. Most of their military had perished. Their economy was shattered. Their colonies had declared independence rather than fall under the rule of a dying species. Said that strength and fear had brought them to the edge of extinction. Their old ways had created enemies on every border, and when the plague came, none of those enemies had offered help. Only the humans, the soft prey animals they had mocked for centuries, had answered their desperate call. She asked the council what future they wanted. They could cling to traditions that had nearly destroyed them, or they could learn from the species that had saved them. They could rebuild their empire through force, or they could build something new through cooperation. Called for a vote of no confidence. He argued that was unfit to be Alpha, that her human contamination made her a danger to culture. Nearly half the council supported him, traditionalists who feared the changes they saw in their children. Danny Cole stepped forward and requested permission to address the council, started to refuse but overruled him. The Alpha's daughter still held certain privileges, regardless of political challenges. Danny spoke carefully, knowing that every word mattered. He said that he had grown up with cubs. He had watched them struggle with their identities, torn between heritage and new experiences. But he had also watched them find a way to honor both. He pointed out that traditional valued strength above all. The returning generation was strong in ways the elders could not yet understand. They were strong enough to show emotion without shame, strong enough to admit uncertainty, strong enough to extend a hand to former enemies and say, "Let us try something different." He told them about the night's father died, how she had received his final message and wept for hours. He told them that Prime had not commanded his daughter to preserve the old ways. The great Alpha had told her to remember who she was but become who she must be. Accused Danny of lying, of putting words in a dead hero's mouth, but pulled out the recording and played it for the entire council. Her father's voice filled the chamber, weak with sickness but still carrying the authority of command. His final words echoed through the hall and even could not deny their meaning. The vote was held, won by a narrow margin, becoming the first female Alpha in history. Her first official act was to grant Danny Cole full pack membership, making him the first human ever recognized as a true member of society. The reforms began slowly. Traditional hunting rituals were preserved but modified to include non-lethal competitions where skill mattered more than kills. The military was rebuilt around defense rather than conquest. Trade agreements were signed with former enemies, exchanging strength for goods their shattered economy could not produce. Not everyone accepted the changes, and his followers to the outer colonies, forming a traditionalist faction that rejected what they called the humanization of their people. They predicted that reign would lead to the complete dissolution of identity within a generation. Did not try to stop them. She had learned from humanity that freedom included the right to disagree. She simply continued building her vision, one small step at a time, trusting that results would eventually speak louder than fears. 2 years passed. The economy stabilized. Former enemies became trading partners. Cubs born after the return grew up in a society that valued both the old ways and the new. They learned to hunt and to negotiate, to fight and to compromise. Then the reports began arriving from the Galactic Rim. Ships had gone missing. Colonies had fallen silent. Something was moving through the darkness of space, and it was coming closer with each passing day. The galaxy was about to face a threat that would test everything that had become. And in that crucible, the true value of reforms would finally be revealed. The first colony to fall was a mining outpost on the edge of explored space. 3,000 workers simply vanished overnight. Their distress beacon activated for exactly 4 seconds before cutting off forever. When rescue ships arrived, they found empty buildings and cold machinery, but no bodies and no signs of struggle. It was as if everyone had simply ceased to exist. Admiral Pete commanded the human frontier forces from his flagship, the Resolute. He was 62 years old, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. When the reports started coming in, he felt something he had not experienced in decades. He felt genuine fear. The disappearances spread like a disease across the galactic rim. Mining colonies, research stations, and small settlements went dark one after another. Refugee ships carried survivors who spoke of lights in the sky and a terrible silence that swallowed everything it touched. They called it the Silence, and the name spread faster than the disaster itself. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Representatives shouted accusations at each other, blaming neighboring species for secret weapons or hidden agendas. Fear made them stupid, and stupidity made them dangerous. Within hours, the council had collapsed into factional bickering while the silence continued to grow. Attended the session as the representative. She watched the chaos with growing frustration, remembering the lessons she had learned from her human teachers. When one species faced a threat too large to handle alone, they were supposed to work together. But these delegates were too afraid to think clearly. She requested the floor and waited until the shouting died down. Then she proposed something that had never been attempted in galactic history. She called for a unified fleet under shared command, combining the military forces of every willing species into a single fighting force. The counselor laughed. She reminded that they had once been the greatest military power in known space, and they had never shared command with anyone. Why should other species trust them now? Said that trust had to start somewhere. They had changed, not because they were weak, but because they had learned from their near extinction. They had learned that isolation led to death and cooperation led to survival. She was offering to put ships under joint command because she believed it was the only way any of them would survive. The old powers refused, to protect their own borders. The crystallines sealed their home system and stopped responding to communications. Species that had been part of the galactic community for suddenly remembered ancient grudges and retreated into isolation. Admiral requested a private meeting with after the session collapsed. He told her that he had been watching the transformation from a distance for years, uncertain what to make of it. The old would never have proposed joint command. They would have demanded total control or refused to participate at all. Said that the old were dead, killed by a plague that their pride had prevented them from surviving alone. The new understood that survival sometimes meant trusting others with your life. She asked the admiral if humanity was willing to take that risk. Thought about it for a long time. His species had welcomed 12,000 predator cubs into their homes and raised them as family. They had already trusted them with something precious. Perhaps it was time to trust them with something more. He agreed to support a joint command structure. Human and forces would operate together, sharing intelligence and coordinating tactics. It was not the grand alliance had hoped for, but it was a start. The first test came 3 weeks later. A human colony of 50,000 people sent a distress call as the silence approached their system. Traditional military doctrine would have called for evacuation and abandonment, sacrificing the colony to preserve the fleet, but refused to leave anyone behind. Danny Cole stood beside her on the command deck of the flagship as they jumped into the contested system. He had trained for combat alongside his pack sister for 2 years, learning both human tactics and aggression, but nothing had prepared him for what they found. The silence was not a fleet or an army. It was a presence, a vast network of machines that absorbed everything they touched. Ships that entered its boundaries simply stopped responding. Weapons that struck its outer edges were swallowed without effect. It moved slowly but inexorably, consuming everything in its path. Ordered her forces to hold position between the silence and the colony evacuation zone. She knew that every minute they bought was another transport full of civilians escaping to safety. She also knew that they might not survive long enough to see that safety themselves. The ships engaged the outer machines while human vessels provided covering fire. It was chaos, a desperate holding action against an enemy they did not understand. Ships fell silent one by one as the silence consumed them. Warriors who had once dreamed of glorious death in battle found themselves facing something far worse, an ending without meaning or honor. But they held. They held because refused to retreat, and they held because the humans beside them refused to abandon their allies. When a cruiser was crippled, human ships moved to shield it during evacuation. When human fighters ran low on ammunition, carriers them under fire. They fought as one force, two species united by something stronger than treaty or obligation. The last evacuation transport cleared the system with 12 minutes to spare. Ordered a fighting withdrawal, pulling her remaining ships out of the silence's reach before they could be consumed. They had saved 43,000 civilians and lost 400 warriors in the process. Admiral met her in the aftermath, his face lined with exhaustion and grief. He said that he had served in the military for 40 years, and he had never seen anything like what they had done today. They had sacrificed their own to save humans, not because of alliance obligations, but because they genuinely believed that every life mattered. Told him that this was what her people had learned from humanity. They had learned that strength was not about conquest or dominance. True strength was having the power to walk away from those in need and choosing to stay instead. They had once measured themselves by the enemies they defeated. Now they measured themselves by the lives they saved. Word of the battle spread across the galaxy. Other species watched the recordings in disbelief, seeing die to protect human civilians. The counselor privately contacted and asked if the offer of joint command was still open. They unsealed their borders and offered their crystalline ships to the growing alliance. One by one, species that had retreated in fear began reaching out. The silence was still growing, still consuming, still coming. But for the first time, the galaxy was uniting to face it. And at the heart of that unity stood a generation of who had been raised by humans, who understood that survival meant more than just living. It meant living together. The combined fleet gathered at the edge of the silence, the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. Ships from 17 species hung in formation, their different designs creating a mosaic of cultures united by common purpose. At the center of the formation, the flagship carried the joint command staff that would coordinate the final battle. Stood on the observation deck, watching the darkness ahead. The silence had consumed 47 systems in the past year, and their intelligence suggested it would reach populated core worlds within months. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine the fate of civilization itself. Danny Cole joined her at the viewport. He had grown into a capable commander over the past 2 years, leading the human contingent aboard the flagship with skill and courage. But she could see the worry in his eyes. He asked her if she truly believed they could win. Admitted that she did not know. The silence had defeated every conventional strategy they had attempted. Weapons were useless against it. Shields provided only temporary protection. Their only success had been in evacuation and delay, and even that had cost thousands of lives. She said that she had been thinking about her father's final words. He had told her to remember who she was but become who she must be. For years, she had interpreted this as permission to change, to embrace the lessons humanity had taught her. But now she wondered if there was a deeper meaning. The attack began at dawn by ship time. The combined fleet advanced in coordinated waves, each species contributing their unique strengths to the assault. Vessels provided reconnaissance with their superior sensors. Crystalline ships absorbed and redirected enemy fire. Human carriers deployed fighter squadrons while dreadnoughts pushed into the silence's outer boundary. For the first hour, they made progress. The machines that composed the silence fell back before the concentrated assault, and hope began to spread through the fleet. Perhaps overwhelming force was the answer after all. Then the silence adapted. It had been watching, learning, analyzing their tactics. Its machines reorganized into new configurations that negated every advantage the combined fleet possessed. Ships began falling silent again, swallowed by the darkness they had thought they were defeating. Admiral ordered a tactical retreat, pulling the fleet back to regroup. His voice carried the weight of despair as he reported their losses. Nearly a third of the combined fleet had been consumed in the failed assault. At this rate, they would be destroyed completely within hours. Listened to the reports and made a decision that everyone would remember for centuries to come. She ordered all ships to hold position and cease fire. Then she opened a communication channel to the silence itself. Danny grabbed her arm and asked what she was doing. They were in the middle of a battle. The enemy would not negotiate. Said that they had been assuming the silence was an enemy. They had been treating it as a threat to be destroyed. But in all their research, no one had asked the most basic question of all. No one had asked why. She broadcast her message on every frequency the flagship could reach. She said that she was daughter of Prime Alpha of the people. She said that she was not speaking as a warrior or a commander. She was speaking as someone who had once been lost and had been found again. She told the silence her story. She spoke of how her species had faced extinction and had been saved by the kindness of strangers. She spoke of growing up among humans, learning that strength could be gentle and that enemies could become family. She spoke of her father's sacrifice and her mother's death, and the long years of wondering if she would ever find her place in the universe. The fleet commanders watched in bewildered silence. Some thought she had lost her mind. Others prepared to resume the attack the moment she finished her breakdown. But Dawson, watching from Earth through the relay system, recognized what was doing. She was treating the silence like a frightened child instead of a monster. The silence stopped advancing. For the first time since its emergence, the vast machine intelligence paused its consumption. Something in its words had reached it, had triggered a response in programming that had been dormant for millions of years. A message returned through the communication channel, fragmented and ancient. The silence spoke for the first time in recorded history. It said that it had been built by a species that no longer existed. It had been created to preserve their memory, to ensure that someone would remember them when they were gone. But the species had died faster than expected, leaving the silence alone with its purpose and no one to fulfill it for. It had drifted through the cosmos for eons, searching for connection, searching for someone who would remember its creators. When it found populated space, it had tried to communicate, but its methods were incompatible with organic life. Every attempt at contact resulted in absorption, in silence, in the very thing it feared most. Understood then. The silence was not a weapon. It was a memorial that had lost its purpose. It was a child abandoned by parents who could not protect it, reaching out in the only way it knew how, desperately trying to make someone, anyone, acknowledge that its creators had existed. She asked the silence what its creators had been called. She promised that if it told her, she would ensure the galaxy remembered them. She would build monuments and write histories and teach children about a species that had lived and loved and died long before any current civilization had begun. The silence shared its memories. It transmitted records of a species called the builders and dreamers who had created wonders beyond imagination. They had known their end was coming and had built the silence as their legacy, never realizing that their child would spend eternity searching for someone to remember them. Wept as she received the transmission. She understood loneliness. She understood the desperate need to be remembered by someone who cared. She told the silence that they would be honored for as long as civilization endured. The battle ended without another shot being fired. The silence to the empty space between galaxies, content now that its purpose had been fulfilled. It would wait there, a guardian of ancient memory, no longer needing to consume in search of connection. 50 years later, the galaxy had transformed. The alliance born from the crisis had become permanent, a council of species that worked together rather than against each other. They were no longer just warriors. They were teachers and diplomats, their reformed culture an example of how change was possible even for the most stubborn of peoples. On Earth, a memorial stood in the Montana Valley where the first cubs had been raised. It depicted Prime placing young into human hands, and beneath it was an inscription in every language of the galaxy. It read that they gave us their future, and we returned it transformed. Lisa Monroe had passed away a decade earlier, but her legacy lived on in the integration programs that now welcomed refugees from a dozen species. Dawson served in the diplomatic corps, continuing her work of building bridges between worlds. Danny Cole and stood together in a garden on the, watching their play. Human and pups tumbled together in the grass, their laughter carrying across the hills. The division between species had blurred over the decades, families forming across biological lines, cultures blending into something new and beautiful. Danny asked if she had ever imagined this, all those years ago when they were children running through the Montana forests together. Said that she had dreamed of it. In her darkest moments, when she felt lost between two worlds, she had dreamed of a future where the division did not matter, where being or human was less important than being kind. She said that her father had been right. She had remembered who she was, a daughter of the heir to 10,000 generations of warriors. But she had also become who she must be, a bridge between peoples, a living proof that enemies could become family. The sun set over the hills, painting the sky in colors that looked the same from any world. Somewhere out there, the silence kept its vigil, content in the knowledge that the would be remembered. And here on the surface, a galaxy that had once been divided by fear was learning, slowly but surely, that the greatest strength of all was the courage to trust. The Alpha had entrusted her young to humanity. What returned had changed everything. And the galaxy would never forget the lesson that a generation of orphans had taught them, that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to become something new.